Welcome back to Real Criminal Story. Here, we don't just retell real criminal cases. We dive into human psychology, impulsive decisions, and moments that lasted only seconds, yet changed multiple lives forever. Today's video is the story of a controversial courtroom testimony in Florida. A teenager, a late-night drive, a plan that initially sounded like reckless teenage behavior until everything spiraled out of control. What makes this case so haunting isn't just what happened that night, but the way the people involved continue to describe it. Because the more testimony you hear, the more questions begin to appear. Who really made the first decision? What actually happened during those fatal few seconds? And did any of them truly realize that night would change everything? Some cases become more confusing the longer you listen to the testimony. A car slowly moving through the night. Two teenagers. A plan that at first sounded not that serious. Then within seconds, everything changed forever. What makes this case disturbing isn't only the crime scene itself, but the feeling that none of them truly believed things would go that far. Until they did. Imagine sitting inside the courtroom. The room is so quiet you can hear chairs shifting across the floor. A teenager sits in front of a microphone, speaking so softly that the judge repeatedly asks him to speak louder so the recording system can capture his testimony. His name is Christopher Horn, Jr., and his testimony would pull the entire courtroom into a maze of contradictions, fragmented memories, and questions that never received clear answers. Christopher testified that he had only known Thomas Stein for about a month before the incident. 1 month. Far too short a time for anyone to imagine it could end in a major criminal case. The two met through mutual friends. They hung out together, smoked marijuana, drove around at night like countless other teenagers. But then, the trial began dissecting every small detail of that night, and everything slowly became much darker. According to Christopher's testimony, the original plan was simply to check car doors in parking lots and neighborhoods to see if any vehicles had been left unlocked. A crime of opportunity. No smashed windows, no professional break-ins. Just driving around quiet areas at night, trying door handles, and leaving if the cars were locked. At least, that was the version Christopher told the jury. But even then, questions immediately started to appear. If the plan was only to check car doors, why bring a gun? Why wear a mask? And why was evidence later destroyed? Christopher claimed the gun he carried that night was unloaded. He testified that before anything happened, he even told Thomas to remove the bullets from his weapon. But prosecutors immediately focused on that detail. If nobody intended for anyone to get hurt, why bring firearms at all during a vehicle burglary spree? It was the kind of question that silenced the courtroom. Because sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't what people do. It's the reasons they give themselves to believe what they're doing isn't that serious. Christopher described driving through multiple locations that night. A movie theater, a neighborhood, a church parking lot, then eventually heading toward Cape Coral Parkway. If you imagine the scene, you can almost see the streetlights reflecting across the windows, nearly empty roads, phone screens glowing in the dark, quiet music playing inside the vehicle, while two teenagers slowly moved deeper into a night they could never take back. Then the testimony began to shift. Christopher repeatedly said the plan went left. A short phrase, but one that appeared over and over again throughout the trial. Everything went too far. But exactly when? Who changed the plan first? That became one of the central questions both prosecutors and defense attorneys tried to answer. According to the testimony, Everything changed after the SUV drove past 3 girls walking down the street at night. Christopher claimed he initially thought one of them was male because of the distance and poor lighting. Prosecutors immediately challenged that explanation. You couldn't see long hair? You couldn't see clothing clearly? You couldn't see anything? Christopher answered that he had been under the influence and that everything happened too fast. Too fast. That phrase kept returning throughout the testimony. According to Christopher, the entire moment between the car doors opening and the gunshot lasted about 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Imagine that. An SUV stopping in the middle of the night, headlights shining directly at a group of people walking, car doors opening, a masked figure in a red hoodie rushing forward. Then almost immediately, a gunshot echoing through the darkness. Christopher said the first thing he screamed was, "Why did you shoot?" That single detail made the entire trial far more complicated. Because if that testimony was true, it suggested that at least one person inside the vehicle never expected things to escalate that far. But then, another question immediately followed. If nobody expected gunfire, why approach strangers at night wearing masks and carrying guns? That's why this case became far more difficult to define than it initially appeared, because it stopped being only about who did what. Instead, it became about the psychological state of the people involved moments before everything collapsed. Christopher testified that after the gunshot, he panicked so badly that he accidentally opened the wrong car door while trying to get back inside. A small detail, but one that caught the jury's attention, because it sounded like the kind of mistake people make during genuine panic. And yet, even that detail didn't make the story clearer, because after leaving the scene, things only became stranger. According to the testimony, clothing was burned, phones were thrown into a river, the gun was later discarded in a canal. If you imagine the entire sequence of events, it feels like watching people desperately trying to erase the traces of a night they themselves no longer understood. But then, another question appeared. If Christopher truly felt shocked and opposed the shooting as he claimed, why continue participating in destroying evidence afterward? That became one of the prosecution's strongest points, and it was also when the trial transformed into a battle over credibility. Because Christopher admitted he had lied to investigators at least twice. At first, he gave incomplete information to protect his family. Later, while facing the possibility of spending most of his life in prison, he began cooperating more fully with prosecutors. And that's when the case entered an uncomfortable gray area. Was this a traumatized witness trying to finally tell the truth? Or someone attempting to minimize his own role in exchange for a lighter legal outcome? Nobody inside the courtroom could say for certain. Even when Christopher claimed that Thomas Stein later called him joking about the incident, many still questioned whether that was true, or whether it was simply the way Christopher chose to describe his co-defendant in front of the jury. Because the longer the testimony continued, the less this case resembled a straightforward chain of events, and the more it resembled a psychological maze. At times, Christopher appeared confused. At times, he became frustrated with attorneys. At other moments, he seemed emotionally overwhelmed. Then, minutes later, he answered questions in a cold, almost detached tone. And that led many people following the trial to ask, which emotions were real? Which memories were real? And did Christopher himself truly remember what happened during those fatal few seconds? By the end of the trial, there was one thing nearly everyone inside the courtroom seemed to agree on. A reckless decision made during one night destroyed multiple futures. One family lost someone they loved. Several lives changed direction forever. And inside that courtroom, people weren't only trying to determine what happened. They were trying to understand how an ordinary night out somehow became a case that shocked an entire community. But maybe the most terrifying part of this entire story is the feeling that none of them truly believed things would go this far, until they did. And even now, after hours of testimony, after endless questions, one thing still has no clear answer. That night, who was really in control? Or from the very beginning, had everything already slipped out of control for all of them?